Chapter 7. The theory of the exchanges. 1. An exchange in commerce is where a person pays his creditor by transferring to him a debt due to himself from some one else. Thus the ordinary case of a person paying a debt by means of a banknote or check, is an exchange. It is what is called novatio or delegatio in Roman law. Two passengers are travelling in an omnibus. The fare is 6 pence. One passenger pays the conductor a shilling. The conductor is then indebted to him in 6 pence. The other passenger has a 6 pence in his hand ready to pay his fare. The conductor, by a nod, tells him to give the 6 pence to the first passenger. By this means the conductor's debt is paid without the trouble of the second passenger handing his 6 pence to the conductor, and the conductor then handing it to the first passenger as payment of the debt due to him. The whole transaction is an exchange. 3 parties and 2 debts are thus necessary to an exchange. We shall show presently that it is very common to have 4 parties. The exchanges is the branch of banking which treats of the remission and settlement of debts between different places by paper documents, and the exchange of the money of one country for that of another. They are merely an exemplification of the doctrines of coinage and credit which have already been explained. 2. When the coins of one country are carried to another, their value is estimated solely by their weight and fineness as bullion, though the natives of the country it belonged to, from long habit and association of ideas, see in it a certain denomination, and may receive it at its nominal value long after it has lost its legal weight. A foreigner sees in it nothing but so much bullion. When a person takes the coin of one country to another, and purchases the coin of that country with it, he is said to exchange it. Now suppose that the coinage of 2 countries is of the same metal and that both coinages are at their full weight and fineness, then if either of them be taken as the standard which may be called A, then the number of units, or parts of a unit of the coinage of the other, which may be called B, which contains precisely the same quantity of pure metal, is called the power of exchange between the country A and the country B. Thus if the legal standard of France and England were gold, and the pound be taken as the standard unit of England, the number of the standard units of the French coinage which contain precisely as much pure gold as the English pound would be the power of exchange between England and France. There is as nearly as possible 1/4 more pure gold in a sovereign than in a 20-franc piece, called a Napoleon. Therefore we might say that 1.25 is the gold power of exchange between England and France. The French exchanges however are expressed in francs, which is a silver coin. Hence if the sovereign contained exactly 1/4 more gold than the Napoleon, we should say that 25 degrees was the power of exchange. If the English coinage of sovereigns became worn, clipped, and degraded, they would not exchange for so many francs as they would do if they were of full weight. An English sovereign might perhaps only exchange for 22 francs, and this would be called a fall in the foreign exchanges. Or if an English merchant were bound to pay his creditor in Paris 2,500 francs, he would have to give more than £100 to purchase them, and the exchange would be said to be so much per cent. against England, by the amount of that difference. It is evident that this adverse state of the exchange would continue so long as the English coinage remained depreciated, but that if it were restored to its legal standard, that restoration would be itself sufficient to restore the exchange to its usual rate. Hence we see that if any country maintains its coinage of full weight and purity, a depreciation of the coinage of England necessarily produces an apparently adverse state of the exchanges, and that a reform of the English coinage is sufficient by itself to restore them to their proper state. It is also evident that a depreciation of the coinage, by a debasement of its purity, will produce exactly the same effects. It is also clear that if the coinage of both countries was equally degraded, the rate of exchange between them would not be altered, and that the rate would vary just in proportion as one was more or less degraded than the other. When the coinage of a country has become depreciated either from wear and tear, or a debasement of the standard, the consequence is said sometimes to be a fall in the foreign exchanges and sometimes a rise in the foreign exchanges, and it is well to fix clearly what these expressions mean, as it might seem that they are contradictory, when they are not so. They only refer to two different methods of estimating the coinage. When a depreciated coinage is said to produce a fall in the foreign exchanges, it means that a given amount of home coinage will purchase a less amount of foreign coin. When a depreciated coinage is said to produce a rise in the foreign exchanges, it means that a greater quantity of home coinage is required to purchase a given amount of foreign coin. A clear understanding of these expressions will prevent any confusion arising when they are used indiscriminately, as they often are, in discussions on the exchanges. It is also evident that there can be no fixed par of exchange between two countries which do not employ the same metal as their legal standard, because their market values are constantly varying from causes quite beyond the reach of any law, and it is no more possible to have a fixed price of one in terms of the other, than to have a fixed legal price for wheat or any other commodity. The very same rule must also apply to two countries, one of which uses gold, and the other silver, as the measure of value. The only correct mode of expressing it is, therefore, to say that such is the usual rate of exchange between them. Although when the coinage is in a depreciated state, the exchange will be apparently adverse with these countries which maintain their coinage in its standard state, it is quite clear that the exchange founded upon the commercial operations of the two countries may be above, below, or at par, and it is very easy to discover its true state. The rate of exchange which arises out of the state of the coinage is called the nominal exchange. The rate which arises out of the commercial operations of the country is called the real exchange. To take an example, suppose the exchange on Paris is 2,521 francs for £100 in gold at the mint price, or when the coinage is at its full legal weight. Then suppose that in consequence of the depreciation of the coinage, the market price of gold bullion rises to £4.38 per oz, then the market price of £100 is £106 1 ls. 7d. Now suppose the exchange on Paris is 23.80, or £100 will purchase 2,380 francs, then £106 11. 7d. would be able to purchase 2,536.36 francs. But as the real par at the mint price is 2,521, it is evident that the difference between these two sums is the extent to which the real exchange is in favor of London. We can also see to what extent the exchange is depressed, because £100 at the above exchange will purchase 2,380 francs. Whereas they ought to purchase 2,536.63 if they were of full weight, and the difference between these two sums shows the extent by which the nominal exchange is depressed. Hence we have the following rule: find the market price of the sum in London compared to the mint price, multiply the market price so found by the rate of exchange, then if the result be equal to the par of exchange, the exchange is at par, and if there be a difference, the exchange is favorable or adverse, according as the difference is above or below the par. And the depression of the exchange caused by the depreciation of the coinage, is the difference between the sum so expressed in the mint and market prices multiplied by the rate of exchange. In the excellent state in which our coinage now is, the question of the nominal exchange, so far as regards this country, is of little importance. But it is essential as regards several foreign countries which use an inconvertible and depreciated paper currency. On the nature of an exchange. 3. We will now show how the example of the nature of an exchange we began with is exemplified in practice. Suppose two cities, London and Edinburgh. Suppose a trader A in London is debtor to a trader B in Edinburgh for a certain sum. Suppose also that a trader B in Edinburgh is debtor to in London for an equal sum. Then, in order to pay their debts, A would have to send the money to B, and would have to send an equal sum to A, thus causing two separate transmissions of bullion between London and Edinburgh, at some expense for freight and insurance. Now this settlement of debts may be greatly facilitated if A in London goes and pays his debt to A, and buys from A the debt due to him from B, and sends this debt by post to B in Edinburgh. B then goes to B and demands payment from him of his debt due to A. Thus it is clear that the whole business has been settled by the transmission of the debt, instead of by the transmission of twice the amount in bullion, and each debtor has paid the debt to the creditor in the same town. The whole transaction is called an exchange, and it is clear that there must be a debtor and a creditor in each city. In the case given there are four parties. but it may be done by three parties. Suppose A in London has a debt due to him from B in Edinburgh, but at the same time owes B an equal sum. To pay his debt to B he has only to give him an order on B, and the accounts between the parties are adjusted without any transmission of bullion. When the debts between London and Edinburgh are equal, they may all be discharged by means of such an exchange, without sending any specie. The exchanges are then said to be at par. Supposing, however, that the debts are unequal, and Edinburgh wishes to send more money to London than it has to receive, it is clear that the demand for bills is greater than the supply, and as everyone would rather send a bill than cash, as it is cheaper to do so, those who had to send money would bid against each other for the bills in the market as for any merchandise, and the price of them would rise, as a premium would have to be paid for a bill on London. London is the great centre of commerce. It is the seat of government to which the revenue is remitted from all parts of the country. The great families from all parts of the country go to reside there, and their incomes must be remitted to them there. Hence there is always a much greater quantity of money seeking to flow from the country to London than the contrary. Consequently the demand for bills on London in the country is greater than the supply, and, therefore, inland bills upon London are always at a premium. This premium is computed by time. If a person wants a bill at sight on London he must pay 1%, or 4 days interest. This is called the time par of exchange, between Edinburgh and London. There is a similar premium on bills, or par of exchange between all other towns in the country on London. This is called inland exchange. The exchange of the country upon London is said to be in favour of London, and against the country. But it must be observed that it is only unfavourable to the buyers of bills, or those who wish to send money. It is equally favourable to the sellers of bills or those who have to receive money. It appears from this that when in any place the demand for bills is greater than the supply, the exchanges are adverse to that place, because it has more money to pay than to receive. When the supply is greater than the demand, the exchanges are favourable to it, because it has more money to receive than to pay. On foreign exchange. 4. The principle of foreign exchange is exactly the same as that of inland exchange. But there is somewhat more complication in the detail, on account of the different monies of different countries. In exchange between two foreign places and of different monies, the money of one place is always taken as fixed, and the exchange is reckoned in the variable quantities of the money of the other given for it. The former is called the fixed or certain price, and the latter the variable or uncertain price. Thus between London and Paris the pound is the fixed price and the exchange is reckoned in the variable sum in francs and cents given for it. On the contrary, between London and Spain the exchange is always reckoned by the variable sum in pence given for the fixed dollar of exchange. When a certain place is taken as a centre, if the fixed price is the money of that place it is said to receive the variable price. On the contrary, when the money of that place is the variable price, it is said to give the variable price. Thus at any time London receives from Paris so many francs and cents for the £1 sterling, and London gives Spain so many pence for the dollar. In the quotation of the rates of exchange it is usual to omit the fixed price, and name only the variable price, and then that is called the rate or course of exchange. According to Tait's Modern Cambist, the following are the present rates of exchange between London and the principal foreign cities. London receives from Amsterdam 11.19 florins and stivers for £1. Germany 20.43 imperial marks and pfennigs 1. France, Italy, Belgium 25.30 francs all lira and kints 1. Switzerland, Austria 10.35 florins and kreuzers 1. London gives 2. Lisbon 53 and 1/4 pence sterling for .1 milreis. Spain 50 and 1/4. Gibraltar 40 and 1/4. St. Petersburg 37 and 1/2 1 silver ruble. Rio de Janeiro 26 and 1/2 1 milreis. New York 49 and 1/2 1 U.S. dollar. Calcutta I government rupee. .23. The above are the mint par rates, but in Austria, Italy, and the United States, these rates are deranged by the paper money of each country. At the present moment the exchange on Italy is about 29 hours 50 minutes, on Austria about 11:50, and on New York about 45. Now if the exchange of London on Paris is against London, or the demand in London for bills on Paris is greater than the supply, it is clear that the pound sterling will purchase fewer francs. Hence between London and Paris, when the exchange is adverse to London, the rates of exchange will fall below par. On the contrary, when the exchange is favourable to London, that is the supply greater than the demand, the rate of exchange will rise above par. And the same is manifestly true with respect to all other places from which London receives the variable price. But if the exchange between London and Spain is against London, or the demand in London for bills on Spain is greater than the supply, then London will have to give more pence to purchase the Spanish dollar. Hence between London and Spain, when the exchange is against London, the rate of exchange will rise above par. On the contrary, when the exchange is favourable to London, she will have to give fewer pence to purchase the Spanish dollar, and consequently the rate of exchange will fall below par. And the same is manifestly true with respect to all other places to which London gives the variable price. Hence when the exchange between London and any other place varies from par, we must always consider whether London gives the variable price to, or receives it from, that place. The interests of the buyers and sellers of bills are always opposite. If the rate of exchange is favourable to the one, it is equally adverse to the other. The buyers of bills are also called remitters, and the sellers are also called drawers. On the limits of the variations of the exchange. 5. Supposing that while the exchange between any two places, say London and Paris, is in a state of equilibrium, that is, when the demand and supply of bills in each city is exactly equal, so that they would each have to receive and send the same sum, it should happen that from any cause whatever, no matter what, there should be a desire on any particular day to send more money from one side than it has to receive. Suppose more money has to be sent from London than it has to receive, then those merchants who want to remit money from London will strive to buy bills on Paris in the London market. But as the demand is greater than the supply, a competition will spring up to buy the bills which are in the market, and hence the price of them will rise. It is their duty to place the bullion in Paris at their own expense and risk, and consequently, they would rather give somewhat more for a bill than its par price, to save themselves that expense. But they will not give more than the cost of transmitting the bullion itself, because, if the price rose higher than that, they would send the money. Thus when the exchange in London rises against London, or in the case of Paris, falls below par, it shows that London wishes to send to Paris more than it has to receive, and the exchange is said to be against London. But it is clear that it cannot continue at a greater rate against London than the cost of transmitting bullion. Hence this is manifestly a superior limit to the variation of the real exchange. But the reverse case may also happen. The supply of bills in London on Paris may exceed the demand. The price of them will therefore manifestly fall. But for similar reasons, the cost of transmitting bullion will be an inferior limit below which the price will not fall. We thus see that the state of the exchanges arising out of the cross-remittances of money is a simple example of the general law of supply and demand, with the limitation that the variation in the rates of exchange cannot exceed a certain definite sum, namely, twice the cost of sending bullion from one place to the other. These limits of the rate of exchange are called specie points, because when the exchanges reach them, bullion may expected to flow in, or out, as the case may be. It is to be observed, however, that these limits of the variations of the exchange, or specie points, only apply to bills payable at once, and to long periods. During short periods, and for bills which have some time to run, temporary causes may produce fluctuations in the exchanges greatly exceeding these limits. On the effects of an inconvertible paper currency on the foreign exchanges. 6. We must now consider the effect of paper money, or an inconvertible paper currency, on the foreign exchanges and the market price of bullion. So long as paper is convertible, that is, so long as the holder of it has power to demand payment of it at sight, it is very clear that it cannot circulate at a discount, because, if it fell to a discount, every person who held it would immediately go and demand gold for it. But if while it is in circulation, the power of convertibility is taken away, then it becomes, in all respects, equivalent to a new standard, just as much as gold and silver, and its value will be affected by the same principles, that is by the sole question of the quantity of it in circulation. compared to the operations it represents. Under the old system of attempting to fix the price of gold and silver relatively to each other, there was no power of convertibility of one into the other similar to the convertibility of the note. If silver fell to a discount as compared with gold, no person could demand as a right to have their silver exchanged for gold. Consequently, the inevitable result of considerable change in the quantity of either metal was a change in their market values. Thus in 1794, gold rose to 84s. If purchased with silver bullion. Now if, speaking by analogy, the silver coin had been convertible into gold, the difference never could have risen, any more than a banknote, convertible at their will of the holder of it, could circulate at a discount. Now paper, when issued as a substantive coinage, follows exactly the same rules. If only the usual quantity of it is issued, that is no greater quantity than would have been issued if it were convertible into specie, it will continue to circulate at its par value. But if these issues be continued, and if it be deprived of the natural character of an over-issue, viz. payment on demand, and it is maintained in circulation, exactly the same result follows as at ends an excessive issue of silver, it falls to a discount. Now the silver coin may fall to a discount from two circumstances: either if silver be coined with too great profuseness, the excessive quantity of it will diminish its value, even though the coin be of full weight, or if the silver coin be suffered to fall into a degraded state by clipping and wearing, so that it does not contain the full legal weight of bullion, it then becomes depreciated. The apparent result in figures will be just the same in either case. Guineas will rise to 24s or 30s. But as silver has general value, and is, from its qualities, a recognized measure of value, it is not correct to apply the term depreciation to it as long as the coin contains its full legal weight of bullion. But the case is different with paper. It is only received on account of bearing a promise to pay a certain quantity of bullion on the face of it, and if it is not able to fulfill that promise it is depreciated. Now if, for the public convenience, it is deemed advisable to issue paper money, or an inconvertible paper currency, the only way of maintaining its currency at par is by limiting its quantity. We do not mean by this by limiting its quantity to an absolute fixed amount, but by devising some means whereby a greater quantity of it shall not be issued than if it were convertible into gold. If more than this be issued, it will be followed by the same result as attends an excessive issue of silver: it will fall to a discount, which in this case is depreciation, and the necessary consequences of a depreciated currency will follow, viz. the market price, or paper price of bullion will rise above the mint price and the foreign exchanges will fall. Now if such a state of things happens, the proper remedy is to diminish the quantity of the paper in circulation until the market price of bullion is reduced to the level of the mint price. If the power of demanding 5 sovereigns be taken away from the holder of a £5 note, still if he can purchase bullion with it in the market to the amount of 5 sovereigns, it is of course a proof that the note is current at par, and the limitation need not proceed beyond that. But if this be not done, the next best thing is to allow all persons to receive the notes at whatever value they choose to put upon them, and to let them make a difference, if they choose, between the prices of articles when paid in gold or in paper. If this be allowed, no very great inconvenience will take place in the internal trade of the country. It is entirely by adopting judicious measures to limit the quantity of notes in circulation that the Bank of France has preserved its notes at par although they are inconvertible. But suppose that the law makes it a crime to make a difference between paper and gold, and a punishable offence to give £20 in gold for £25 in paper. What will be the consequence? Exactly the same as we have seen happen when the silver and gold coins were improperly rated. The one which was underrated disappeared from circulation. This has happened both in the case of gold coin and silver coin. Now when paper money is issued in too great abundance, and has a tendency to overflow the channel of circulation, its natural effect is to raise prices when paid in it. If people were free in their transactions, they would gradually make a difference in price between payments in paper and payments in bullion. But if the owners of the coin are prevented by law from receiving more for it than the same nominal sum in paper, they will do exactly the same thing as is invariably done when in a metallic currency, part is depreciated and part is of full weight. they will either hoard or export it. At all events it will disappear from circulation. As the gold gradually disappears and paper issues multiply, people begin to estimate all prices by the paper price, and the paper ends by finally displacing the entire gold coinage. The convertibility of the coin into the legal amount of bullion is the test of the depreciation of the metallic currency. So the convertibility of the note into coin is the test of the depreciation of the note. When paper becomes the standard of currency, the market price of bullion means the price of it paid in paper money, or the paper price of it, and it is clear that if the paper price of bullion rises above the mint price, it is the proof and the measure of the depreciation of the paper currency. Whenever the currency of a country becomes redundant, that is to say when prices are raised so much higher in one country than in its neighbors, that the value of money sensibly diminishes, the natural corrective for such a state of things is to take a certain portion of it out of circulation, so that by diminishing the quantity of it its value may be raised. When people find that the same quantity of gold will not purchase an equal amount of commodities in this country as they will in another, their own natural instincts will lead them to purchase commodities abroad where they are cheap, and bring them for sale here where they are dear. The natural instincts of trade will, therefore, produce an equilibrium in value in the currency of neighboring countries. When the currency of a country consists partly of paper and partly of gold and silver, it is quite clear that only the metallic portion of it can be exported in payment of foreign commodities. The paper portion of it, which has no value abroad, must remain at home. If the issues of paper be continued so as to prevent the currency from recovering its value, the process of the exportation of the metallic portion will go on until it is entirely exhausted. If this be the case, the only method of restoring the currency to its par value is by diminishing the quantity of the paper, until the drain is stopped by the enhancement of the value of the whole currency. Some persons used to maintain that as the gold goes out, paper should be issued to supply the vacuum until the gold comes back. But it requires little sagacity to see that if that be done the gold never will come back again, and the drain will not cease until it is totally exhausted, and the only way to bring it back again is to raise its value at home, which can be done only by removing the plethora of paper. We have seen that with bullion, the rate of exchange can never continue very long above or below the cost of transmitting bullion, but the nominal exchange can vary to any amount according to the depreciation of the coinage. The very same effect follows an excessive issue of paper money, and it may fall to any amount of depreciation. And just as the rise of the paper price of bullion above the mint price shows the depreciation of the paper, so the same thing will manifestly cause a fall of the foreign exchange below the limits of the real exchange. On exchange operations. 7. Exchange operations consist in buying, selling, importing and exporting bullion, called bullion operations, and buying and selling bills, called banking operations. The calculations necessary to ascertain the profit and loss on such operations are given at length in various technical works on the subject, to which we must refer any of our readers who are practically concerned in such matters. Our object only is to examine the general causes which produce these movements of bullion which so sorely vex the banking and commercial world. Exchange operations of both sorts may be either direct or indirect, that is, they may take place directly between the two countries, or the final operations may be effected through the medium of one or more intermediate countries. We have observed that for bills payable at sight the limits of the variations of the exchanges cannot exceed the cost of transmitting bullion, which are called the specie points, because when they are reached, bullion may be expected to flow in or out. When the bills however have a considerable time, such as 3 months or more, to run, before they are payable, causes may operate which may produce temporary fluctuations of the exchange considerably beyond these limits. These are chiefly 1. The necessity that the holders of these long-dated bills may have to realize them, even at a considerable sacrifice, to maintain their own position. 2. The doubtful position of the acceptors, or the general discredit of the place they are drawn upon. 3. The differing relative values of the precious metals which are the standards of payment at each place. 4. The respective rates of discount at each place. Now it may very often happen that from these combined causes, it may be considerably more profitable to possess bullion at one place than at another. Whenever this is the case, Exchange operators export bullion from one place to another for the sake of the profit. They create bills upon such a place. They draw upon their correspondents, discount their bills, and remit the proceeds to meet their drafts when due. It used to be the dogma of many commercial writers that bullion is only exported to discharge a previous state of indebtedness, and that, consequently, a drain of bullion comes to a natural end when the indebtedness is discharged. But this is a most grievous error. The sufficient difference of profit in possessing bullion at two places will cause a fabrication of bills for the purpose of exporting bullion, without any previous indebtedness, and of course this will continue as long as this possibility of profit exists. Consequently, unless this profit is destroyed, the drain of bullion will not cease. The effectual way of annihilating this profit is by raising the rate of discount. It is manifest that in such operations, the difference of profit between the two places must exceed twice the cost of transmitting bullion, because in such cases, the cost of transmitting bullion both ways will fall on those who originate them. Between countries in which there are no restraints on trade, the exchanges will never vary much except on some sudden emergency. But there are countries with which, owing to the prohibitive laws which infest their commercial codes, the exchanges are permanently unfavorable, because they will take nothing but bullion for their commodities. Russia is one of these countries, and hence if not modified by other circumstances, bills upon Russia would always be at a premium. But here again the effect of trafficking steps in, which always has a tendency to equalize prices. The merchant, as we may call him, who deals in bills acts upon the same principles as the dealer in any other commodities. He buys them where they are cheapest, and sells them where they are dearest. Hence he will try to buy up Russian bills cheaper in other exchanges, or debt markets, and sell them in the London debt market. On the other hand, from the course of trade between England and Italy, the debt which Italy owes to England is usually greater than the contrary, hence Italian bills will usually be at a discount, or cheap, in their London debt market. So the bill merchant buys them up cheap here, and sends them to some other market, Paris for instance, where they may be at a premium. By these means the price of bills is raised where they are cheapest and depressed where they are dearest, and the general result will be to melt all the differences between separate countries into one general result, so that the exchanges will not be favorable with one country and adverse with another, but they will be generally adverse or favorable with all the rest of the world. Supposing, however, a merchant has to remit money to Paris, while the exchange with Paris is unfavorable to England, he may possibly discover a more advantageous way of remitting it than by buying a bill on Paris directly. Thus for instance, while bills on Paris are at a premium in London, those on Hamburg may be at a discount, and bills on Paris may be at a discount in Hamburg. So if the merchant buys a bill on Hamburg and sends it to his agent there, and directs him to purchase a bill on Paris with the proceeds, he may be able to discharge his debt in Paris at a less sum than he would have to pay for a bill on Paris in London. This circuitous way of settling his debt involves additional charges for brokerage, commission, postage, and sea. But the effect of it is still further to equalize the exchanges between London and all other countries. This circuitous method is called the arbitration of exchanges, and the sum which is given in London for the ultimate price it realizes in Paris is called its arbitrated price. When only 3 places are used in such an operation it is called simple arbitration. When more than 3 are employed, it is called compound arbitration. The practical rules for working out these results will be found in any technical book on the subject. But it is very evident that the quicker, safer, and cheaper the communication between countries becomes, the less room will there be for such operations, because the limits of the variations of the real exchanges, which are the margin which renders such transactions possible, will constantly diminish. The scale on which these indirect operations of exchange is carried on is immense, and peculiarly affects the London Exchange. There is no exchange between places to and from which remittances have not constantly to be made. Hence, when such places trade, their accounts must be settled by means of drafts upon some third recognized center. London is the banking center of the world. From the enormous exports of England to all quarters of the globe, remittances have to be made to London from every part of the world. There is, therefore, a constant demand for bills upon London to discharge the debts incurred for these commodities. Hence, although the exporters may send their goods to different countries, yet if they can draw upon London, their bills will be sure to find some purchasers somewhere to be remitted to England. Hence bills upon London bear a higher price, and meet with a readier sale than those upon other places. One country A may import from another B less than she exports, and consequently a debt is due from A to B. Also B exports to another country C more than she imports, and consequently a debt is due from C to B, and A may discharge its debt to B by transferring to it its claim against C. As many countries trade with one another between which there is no exchange, their claims are mutually adjusted by drafts upon London, the commercial centre. Hence the London Exchange is the most important in the world, and requires the greatest attention to be paid to it. There are arbitrated prices of bullion in the same way as there are arbitrated rates of exchange, but we need not enter into them here. On the real or commercial exchange. 8. We must now consider the real or commercial exchange, which arises out of the transactions between this and other countries. As the British Islands do not produce the precious metals to any extent worth considering, they are only to be obtained in this country by importation, and we must now consider the various sources from which they come, and the different causes that produce an inflow or outflow of them. They are to be treated in every other respect like any other foreign commodity, and are obtained by the same means as any other one which we require for domestic consumption, which is not a native product. The trade in bullion may be divided into two distinct branches, the one where it is carried on directly with the countries in which gold and silver are native products, and the other with those countries which do not produce it, but which, like our own, have no means of supplying themselves with it except by foreign commerce. With bullion producing countries. Before the discoveries in California and Australia, the chief bullion producing countries were Mexico and Peru. We need not specify others because the same principle applies to them all, and to describe them all would rather belong to a work on commerce generally. British merchants have establishments, or correspondents, in these countries, to whom they consign their goods, and their agents exchange them for bullion brought down by the natives, and which is collected in large quantities, and in former times, before the invention of steam navigation, used to be brought home by men of war for the sake of security. In these countries bullion is treated exactly like any other commodity, such as tea, or wool, or wine, or timber, and British goods of all kinds are exported to them for the express purpose of being exchanged for bullion to be remitted home. The limits of this exportation are precisely similar to the limits of the exportation of goods to any other country. It is clear that by the time the bullion reaches this country, it ought to be sufficient to cover the original price of the goods, and all the charges on them on their way out, as well as the agent's commission there. The charges for freight, insurance, and commission for bringing it home, and a fair mercantile profit over and above all these expenses. Unless it does that, the commerce is not profitable. The purchase of bullion then in these countries is a very simple affair, and requires no further notice. 2. With countries which do not produce bullion. The causes which produce an inflow or outflow of bullion, between this and other countries like it which do not produce bullion, are much more intricate. Taking this country as the center, we may consider that the transmission of bullion to or from it is influenced by the 7 following causes. 1. The balance of payments to be made to or by it. 2. By the state of the foreign exchanges. 3. By the state of the currency. 4. By remittances made to this country, as the commercial center of the world, to meet payments due to other countries. 5. By the political security of this and neighboring countries. 6. By the state of the money market, or the comparative rates of interest in this and neighboring countries. 7. By the free or prohibitive commercial tariffs of this and foreign countries, as they permit or forbid our manufactures to be imported into them. There are, then, 7 different causes which act upon the movements of bullion, and we see at once what a complicated subject the foreign exchanges is, because these 7 different causes may be acting in all sorts of different ways, in conjunction or opposition, and of course it requires an intimate knowledge of commercial affairs at any particular time to know how they do operate. The inveterate error of mercantile opinion for a long time was, that there is only one cause which causes an export of bullion, namely a balance of payments to be made. It appears that the simplest way of arriving at an accurate knowledge of the subject is to consider that the dealings between nation and nation are only made up of the aggregate of dealings between individuals of the nations, and we have only to consider the variety of methods in which an individual merchant may trade to have a comprehensive idea of the commerce of the nation. Suppose a merchant of London sends £1,000 of goods to Bordeaux. By the time they arrive there, the mere addition of freight, insurance, and other charges, would probably have raised their cost of production, or the expense of placing them there, to £1,050. But as the merchant would never have sent them to that market, unless he expected to realize a good profit, we may assume that the market is favorable and that they sell for £1,500, and he would probably draw against his agent for £1,000. His correspondent at Bordeaux, instead of remitting the money to London, would prefer in ordinary circumstances to invest the proceeds of the goods in some native product, which would fetch a good price in London. The chief native product of that country is wine, so the agent would invest the proceeds of the goods, after deducting all charges for freight, commission, and in Bordeaux wine, and send it to England. This wine would probably be sold at a considerable profit in the English market, say it would fetch £2,000. And after deducting all the charges of every description on the cargoes both ways, the difference would be the merchant's profit. In this case it is quite clear that no bullion would pass between the countries, and therefore there would be no question of exchanges. The London merchant's agent at Bordeaux would be governed by several considerations as to whether he would remit specie or wine to London, and he would be guided chiefly by the state of the wine markets both at Bordeaux and London. For supposing the goods to be sold at a good profit at Bordeaux, he must next consider the price of the wine at Bordeaux, and also what it might be expected to fetch in London. If some great disaster had happened to the vines so that there was a failure of the crops, the price of wine at Bordeaux might rule excessively high, but at the same time there might be a large stock of wine in London, and the price might not be unusually high, so that if he were to purchase wine at Bordeaux, and send it to London, it might be a loss. In such a case as this, if there were no other native product to send, he would find it more advantageous to remit specie, whatever the goods would sell for, and then the exchange would be in favor of London, but before the London merchant could reckon his profits he would have to deduct the freight, insurance, and on the specie. It must be observed however that the example of the product which we have taken, wine, is not a very good one to illustrate the principle, because wine is an article which may be kept for several years before it is used, and the merchant may let import the wine, even though it would not pay at existing prices, in the expectation that in process of time the price of it would rise in consequence of the scarcity. An example of a product which required immediate consumption would have been a better illustration. If we suppose that Bordeaux had but one native product, wine, the chances of finding the markets, both at Bordeaux and London, in a favorable state for importing produce instead of specie, would be limited to that single article. But if it had other products, such as olive oil, the chances would be increased of finding articles to suit the market, and the chances would evidently be multiplied according to the number and variety of its products. Hence we see the great importance of having as great a variety 28 possible in a market, because the more articles there are, the more chances there are that commercial indebtedness may be settled by products rather than by specie. Whether the transaction was profitable or not to the London merchant would entirely depend on the amount of specie he received after deducting all charges, and if he had purchased the goods he sent out from England cheap, and there was a scarcity of them at Bordeaux, he might realize high prices there, which might leave him a good profit. It would be very improbable that he could realize so much profit on that single operation as in the double one of exporting goods and importing wine, so that the import of the specie would be less profitable to him and the nation at large, than the import of the wine. The reasons which caused the export of specie from Bordeaux, and the import of it into England, in this case, are very plain. They were the scarcity and dearness of the native products at Bordeaux, and the abundant supply of them already in the London market. Hence we gather that the scarcity and dearness of native products is an infallible cause of the export of specie from a country. On the contrary, an already existing abundant supply of products both domestic and foreign is a certain cause of its import into a country, just as people flock to buy in a well-stocked and cheap market. The exchange being in favor of a country means nothing more than that bullion has to be remitted to it. In the case above described, the exchange at Bordeaux would be in favor of London, but this simple case is as good as 1,000 to show the extreme and dangerous fallacy of drawing any conclusion as to the advantage of the trade to England, from the simple fact of the exchange being favorable to her, and inflow of bullion taking place. The example given above is of the simplest description, and a merchant of eminence, who has correspondents in several different parts of the world, might easily multiply these operations so as to trade with many markets before the returns of his cargo were brought home. Thus, instead of having the wine sent home from Bordeaux, his correspondent might find it more profitable to send it to Buenos Aires, and dispose of it there. The chief native product of that place is hides, and we may suppose that his correspondent there might invest the proceeds of the cargo of wine in hides, which there might be a favorable opportunity of selling in the West Indies. When the cargo arrived in the West Indies, instead of remitting the proceeds directly home, it might very well happen that, owing to a scarcity of corn at home, it might be very high there and cheap in Canada, so he would invest the proceeds of the hides in sugar, and dispatch that to Canada, where the merchant's correspondent there would dispose of it, and purchase corn, which he would send to England. In the case just described, we observe that there are two distinct operations, and, as we may suppose that there is a profit upon each of them, by the time the returns for the goods, which originally cost £1,000, are brought to England, it may very well be, that the corn, which forms the ultimate payment of them, may be several times as valuable as the original cargo, and as the charges on each operation are deducted before investing the proceeds in other articles, it is clear that the merchant's profit upon the whole is exactly the difference in value between the articles last purchased and sent home and the original cargo, after deducting all the expenses of sending home the last cargo, and it is also seen that no specie has been sent from one country to the other in the whole course of the extended operation. There will be no difficulty in considering the reverse case in which the operation is commenced from the foreign country. Suppose the starting point is New York. The staple products of America are breadstuffs and provisions. A merchant of New York sends a cargo of corn to Liverpool, and his correspondent there will endeavor to invest the proceeds of that in British goods. If he finds the state of the markets in England and New York will make such an operation profitable. Suppose the price of corn is very high here, and British goods are also very high here, and very low in America, it is clear that nothing but specie will be sent. In cases where a great and unexpected dearth of corn occurs in England, and its price rises enormously high, the infallible result is to cause a great drain of specie for the time being, because our necessity for food is much more pressing and immediate than our necessity or capability of consuming our cotton or woolen goods. And the only way to arrest such a drain is to effect such a reduction in the price of British goods as to make it more profitable to export goods than specie. And we shall see in the next chapter that it was this precise object which the Bank Act of 1844 was intended to effect. The varieties of trading described are sufficient to suggest the following rules regarding the inflow or outflow of bullion. The cause of bullion being imported is either when the price of goods is so low in England and so high in the foreign market that foreigners are tempted to send here to buy, or English merchants are tempted to export. 2. The cause of bullion being exported from England is that there is some great and pressing demand for some article in this country, and other commodities are so scarce and dear that they cannot be exported with a profit, or that the article is required in such great quantities that the foreigner cannot consume our goods, which we would prefer to send in payment, fast enough, and so specie must be sent, and the greater the difference in price the greater will be the drain of bullion, or that other markets are already overstocked with our products, which are depressed below their usual market value there. This is what is meant by overtrading, and from this circumstance we see that overtrading is a sure precursor of a drain of bullion from the country. When there has been a great failure of the crops in this country, so as to cause a famine price, the demand for corn is so immediate and urgent that it necessarily causes a drain of specie, and it is then of the greatest possible consequence that the prices of other commodities should be as low as possible. to enable them to be sent in payment of the necessary supplies of food, and prevent such a drain of bullion as may disturb the whole monetary system of the country. Overtrading, and a failure of the cereal crops of this country are each of them sure causes of a drain of bullion. The most disastrous event for the commerce of this country is when both these circumstances happen concurrently. It is like a spring tide of disaster. The monetary crisis of 1847 was brought on by several years of overtrading followed by successive failures in the staple support of the people of England and Ireland, on the rate of discount as affecting the exchanges. 9. We have now to treat of a cause of the movement of bullion which has acquired an importance in modern times far exceeding what it ever did before. In fact, it is more important than any other, except a depreciated paper currency, viz. a difference in the rate of interest or discount between two countries. Formerly, when the communication was slow and expensive between different places, before the days of railroads and steamers, a considerable difference might exist in the rates of discount in two places, without causing a movement of bullion from one place to another. But that is not possible now. The communication between places is so rapid now, that directly the difference between the rates of discount in any two places is more than sufficient to pay for the expense of sending the bullion, an immediate flow of bullion commences from one place to another, and this is in exact accordance with the usual mercantile principle which operates in every other, that if the difference of price case of the same article in any two markets is more than sufficient to repay the cost of sending it from one to the other, it will be sent, and this movement will continue as long as the difference in price continues. Now, if the rate of discount in London is 3%, and that in Paris is 6%, the simple meaning of that is that gold may be bought for 3% in London and sold at 6% in Paris, but the expense of sending it from one to the other does not exceed 1%, consequently, it leaves 21% profit on the operation. The natural consequence immediately follows. Gold flies from London to Paris, and the drain will not cease until the rates of discount are brought within a certain degree of equality. It used to be the common delusion of mercantile men that gold was only sent to pay a balance arising from the sale of goods, and that it must cease of itself whenever these payments were made. But this is a profound delusion. When the rates of discount differ so much as is supposed above, between London and Paris, persons in London fabricate bills upon their correspondents in Paris for the express purpose of selling them for bullion, which they then remit to Paris, and which they can sell again for 6%. It is quite evident that this drain will not cease so long as the difference in the rates of discount is maintained. Moreover, merchants in Paris immediately send over their bills to be discounted in London, and have the cash remitted to them. Now the only way of arresting such a drain is to equalize the rate of discount in the two places. These simple facts are a perfectly conclusive answer to those writers who complain of the variations of the rate of discount by the Bank of England, and suppose that it is possible to maintain a uniform rate. Consequently, at the present day, it is the imperative duty of the Bank of England to keep a steady watch upon the rates of discount in neighboring countries, and to follow this variations so as to prevent its being profitable to export bullion from this country. On foreign loans, securities, and remittances as affecting the exchanges. 10. Besides the state of national indebtedness, arising out of commercial operations, there are other causes which seriously affect the exchanges. Formerly England, being more abundant in money and material resources than men, used to subsidize foreign powers to a great extent, and the method of transmitting such a loan to the best advantage to the remitting country is an operation of considerable nicety and delicacy. An actual and sudden withdrawal of a very large amount of bullion from a commercial country would cause the most disastrous consequences when so many engagements had to be met at a fixed time. When such necessities arise, the operation is effected by bills of exchange. These events, however, occur but rarely, and are not the ordinary operations of banking, and therefore to give an account of how they are effected would be beyond the limits of this work. If any readers desire to see practical examples of such operations, we may refer them to our Principles of Economical Philosophy and Theory and Practice of Banking, where some are given, especially the most gigantic one ever effected, the payment of the indemnity by France. Public securities, however, of all sorts, bonds of commercial companies, now form a regular article of import and export between various countries, and affect the exchanges exactly like any other merchandise, but as these all pass through the post office, and not through the custom house, it is impossible to have any record of their quantity, and consequently the subject of the exchanges is a hopeless puzzle to any persons who only look to the official returns of merchandise published by the Board of Trade. There is, lastly, to be considered the sums required by residents abroad for their expenditure. The drafts of the great English and Russian families on their bankers at home, affect the exchanges, exactly in the same manner as any other drafts on monetary and political convulsions as influencing the exchanges. 11. As an immediate consequence of the preceding principles, it follows that a political or monetary convulsion in any country will immediately turn the exchanges in favor of that country, if such an event is not prevented by the issue of an inconvertible paper currency. The reason is plain. Any political or monetary convulsion is attended by a great destruction of credit. This credit, while it existed, performed the functions of money, but as soon as it is destroyed, there is an intense demand for money to fill the void. Money rises enormously in value. Multitudes of persons are obliged to sell their goods at a sacrifice. The consequence is that money, having risen greatly in value, both with respect to goods and debts, an immense quantity will flow in from neighboring countries. Thus in 1799 there was a great commercial crisis at Hamburg. The rate of discount rose to 15%. That immediately drained bullion from England. In 1825 there was a great commercial crisis in England. For a considerable period the bank, by making extravagant issues at a low rate of discount, had turned the foreign exchanges against the country. But no sooner did the crisis occur in December, than the foreign exchanges immediately turned in favor of it. Exactly the same thing happened in 1847. No sooner had the crisis in that year fairly set in than the exchanges turned in favor of the country. And numerous other examples might be cited if necessary. On the means of correcting an adverse exchange. 12. The preceding paragraphs show upon what complicated causes those great movements of bullion depend which produce such important consequences. There are three great economic quantities, products, bullion and debts, all seeking to be exchanged, all flowing from where they are cheaper to where they are dearer. But all this vast superstructure of credit, this mighty mass of exchangeable property, is based upon gold bullion. Different methods of doing business require different quantities of bullion, but however perfect and refined the system may be, we must come at last to a basis of bullion, as its moderator and regulator. If, therefore, the bullion be suffered to ebb away too rapidly, the whole superstructure is endangered, and then ensues one of those dreadful calamities, a monetary crisis. We have endeavored to explain the different causes which produce an adverse exchange, so that if one takes place the proper corrective may be applied. If it be caused by a depreciated currency, there is no cure but a restoration of the currency to its proper state. When however it arises from a balance of indebtedness from commercial transactions, there are but two methods of correcting it, an export of produce and a rise in the rate of discount. It used to be a doctrine often asserted that an adverse exchange was in itself an inducement to export, on account of the premium at which bills could be sold. What truth there was in this doctrine can only be known to those actually engaged in such operations. But a very much more certain means of producing an export of goods is a lowering of their price. We shall enter into this more fully in the next chapter. We have observed that a difference in the rate of discount between any two countries more than sufficient to pay for the transmission of bullion, will produce a flow of bullion from one to the other. But as all the cost of transmission both ways falls on the operator, the difference requires to be more considerable than might appear at first sight. And if they are 3 months' bills, the profit reaped will be only 1/4 of the apparent difference. Thus Mr. Goshen says there must be a difference of 2% between London and Paris, before the operation of sending gold over from France, for the sake only of the higher interest, will pay. And between other continental cities, of course, the difference may be much greater. But whatever the difference may be, the method is absolutely certain. Directly the rate of discount rises here, people cease to export bullion from here, and the continental bankers and brokers increase their demand for English bills. And as the rate rises, the demand will increase, until at last the price reaches the specie point, and gold begins to flow in, and as the rate rises more powerful will be the attraction, until at last the necessary equilibrium is restored between bullion and credit.